And we are live. Welcome everybody. I can see people joining already. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give people another minute or two to log in. While we wait, you will be seeing us on the screen and we will get started shortly. Thank you. Okay, we will get started in one more minute, everybody. We don't want to delay too much longer because we do have a hard stop today at 6:45.
15. 6:15.
6:15, I'm sorry. All right. I think, Brian, I think the intel that you got might have been correct because I'm looking at the number and it's not as high as we were expecting.
Okay. So hopefully she can get that distributed to people and they can join quickly.
Yeah. So we'll give them another 30 seconds and see. It is clicking up, so that's a good sign. Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get started in the interest of time. Apologies to people who have not gotten the link, and unfortunately we have to get started. We did resend it and hopefully some people will be able to continue to join as we start, but because we are constrained by time, we will get started now and see how that goes. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Aya Simone, a member of the board here at the League of Women Voters of Greenwich. On behalf of the League and also on behalf of the Greenwich PTA Council, I'd like to welcome you to another wonderful community speaker series. Today, we're hosting a community conversation with Dr. Toni Jones, the Superintendent of Greenwich Public Schools. Welcome, Dr. Jones. We also have two moderators, one from the League of Women Voters, Anne-Marie Hesser, a board member and a member for the last few years, as well as Brian Peltunis from PTAC. Thank you both for joining us and being moderators. I'd like to take a second to explain how today's event will flow. As you know, we're doing a webinar today instead of a meeting, and that's an important difference. With a webinar, all attendees will remain on mute without audio or visual access. You will be able to see the speakers and the moderators for the duration of the event. Our moderators will lead the discussion for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and we will follow that discussion with 15 to 20 minutes of audience Q&A. Audience members, you will be able to submit your questions at any time. If you look at the bottom of your screen, depending on whether you're on a desktop or on a mobile, if you're on a desktop, you should see it in the bottom right-hand corner not quite the corner, but towards the corner. If you're on a mobile device, it will be on the top of your screen. It's a Q&A bubble, speech bubble, and you'll be able to submit your questions by typing it in to that chat box. We asked for your questions in advance also, in the hope that we could ensure that we answered and covered the questions that most people wanted to address. So we will incorporate those into the Q&A session. Anyone who submitted the questions in advance, if it hasn't already been asked, we will endeavor to answer your questions from the emails, and we will do our best to get through as many as possible. If we have more questions than we can answer in a 15 to 20 minute Q&A session, Dr. Jones has been kind enough to say that she has an extra 10 to 15 minutes to extend the Q&A, and that means that we have a hard stop at 6:15. So stick with us. We will get through this as quickly as we can, and we will be done by 6:15. If we are unable to cover all the Q&A questions, there are extensive Q&A questions in an FAQ document that is available online. We will make that available here during the event. You'll see it on the screen, and we'll also make it available to you after the event on our websites and on the BOE, Board of Education websites. Today's presentation is going to be an exciting conversation. It's a very topical discussion. Many people have been asking these questions of us, meaning the League of Women Voters of Greenwich, as well as to PTAC, and of course to Dr. Jones herself. We know that there's a lot to discuss, and we'll do our best to get through the questions that are most important to you in the time that we have allocated. Before we begin, I just wanted to give you a couple of updates from the League side. We have a lot of presentations and events coming up over the next 3 months, and we hope that you'll join us for those events. We have a fireside chat for our annual general meeting with our guest speaker, Annie Lamont, who will be discussing what the private sector can teach government, which should be a really interesting discussion. That's also going to be a Zoom event, so stay tuned for the details there. And in October, we will have another fantastic community speaker series with the Connecticut Secretary of State, Denise Merrill, and we will let you know how to participate in that going forward. And of course, we have lots more information and lots more events and lots more resources available to you on our website. So we will share that with you also at the end. But without further delay, I'd like to hand things off to our moderators, and I'd like to introduce you to Anne-Marie Hesser from the League of Women Voters. Anne-Marie, take over.
Good afternoon. I am Anne-Marie Hesser, Chair of Youth Outreach for the League of Women Voters, and I'm joined tonight by Brian Peldunas, President of the Greenwich PTA Council. The 2021 calendar year arguably presents the educational community with the greatest challenge it has ever confronted, as schools make plans to reopen during the coronavirus pandemic. Greenwich Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Toni Jones, is overseeing the efforts of the leaders of our public school system to develop an opening plan that optimizes the safety, well-being, and education of our children while operating within a realistic town budget. As well, there are numerous issues related to the school district of importance to voters. Dr. Jones has agreed to take time out of her very busy schedule to talk with us this evening. Brian and I will begin by presenting alternating questions of interest to our viewers. We will then finish up with questions posed by the audience via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Brian.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Dr. Jones' first question is actually two parts. From an educational perspective, two areas of concern stand out: social emotional learning and achievement. The first question regards SEL. Is the district prepared for the SEL needs of students in their cohorts or other groupings, as well as the needs of individual students?
Yes, I mean, we believe that our SEL programming is very strong, and we actually were just working on that as recent as today. And we want to make sure that while student achievement is critically important, social emotional learning during COVID, and I would just even say social emotional, emerged as something that was even more important than it has been over the last, decade. And when we look at right now, a lot of the issues and challenges, especially in some of our young people, when we look at that high school age range, especially, we're seeing suicide rates across the United States go up. They attribute that to a lot of what's happening with the depression. Students are losing some events that, when you're 16 and 17 mean the world to you. They're really dealing with a lot. So in our hybrid program, we have built SEL in to the end part of the day. Also at the beginning of the day, just greeting students in a different way. The first block in the morning at high school, for instance, is longer. In our younger grades, middle grades, we also have built in SEL time as part of our schedule. So we are definitely taking a serious approach to that and feel as though we're ready.
Okay. Second part of that is regarding achievement. Has the curriculum been modified or reduced in any way for this coming year to accommodate remote or hybrid models? Or has the expectation of a full year of learning been made clear to principals and teachers? Follow on what is being done to understand and then eliminate any gaps in curriculum coverage resulting from the distance learning experience in March through June.
I think there's like 3 questions in there.
She can count too.
I'll start with from the student achievement perspective. We actually have a brand new instructional planning software that we'll be using this year. And for K-8, we actually will be assessing on the end of last year. So if you have a 5th grader, they're going to assess on the end of 4th grade so that we know which standards they mastered and which standards perhaps we need to go back and reteach. And we'll be able to look at that on the individual student level, on a class level, on a grade level. So we are very well equipped for that. In the high school, they will do a lot of formative assessments with students to determine, again, if there are gaps and holes that need to be filled in. So we are prepared with a brand new software. It's going to really help us. As a matter of fact, we were in training, I believe it was just today, the train the trainer models. And so we're prepared for that. What's the next part of your question, Brian? Sorry.
Well, that was the second part. The first part was, has the curriculum been modified or reduced in any way?
No, it hasn't. And, our goal going into this school year is to teach the curriculum in full. We have and I know this will come up probably another question, but even our schedule is much tighter going into this year. It's the same schedule. A student, whether they're in remote or whether they're in school, the schedule follows a set day, where last year everything happened very quickly. We had families that still didn't have internet access. We were doing a lot of problem solving that we're not going to be doing this year. Also, our community very strongly at the end of the year gave us feedback. They really would like a more set schedule for their children. So we've made all of those adjustments going into this school year. And they will have their full curriculum just as they would have at the beginning of last year.
Okay, good. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Anne Marie?
Dr. Jones, COVID may have the result of highlighting and expanding gaps in our educational system between the underserved households and more privileged students. Access to technology, for instance, as you just said, will vary from family to family. As well, there has been discussion in town of the difference between private and public schools in their approach to teaching during the coronavirus epidemic. How are the Greenwich Public Schools working to resolve these differences in access to technology? And what other steps are being taken to optimize educational opportunities for underserved families?
I have to say, even last spring, I'm very proud of the work that we did to make sure that we were working as hard as possible to have equitable environment. All of our students in K-5 have iPads. All of our students in 6 through 12, have a laptop. And, we made sure that even our support system, if a laptop broke, their Chromebook broke, we had 24-hour turnaround service. There were about 4 of us that stayed here in the office to make sure that we were providing that service. We had a family who didn't have a car. They needed to stay home with little ones, couldn't come and pick up the new Chromebook. We drove it to their house and did home deliveries. But it's not only just, I think, from the tools and resources, we made sure that we didn't have that food insecurity. So our food program, ran seamlessly, literally a day after we closed, and it still hasn't stopped. It's been running all through the summer, and we had stops all around town so that we could take care of those families who needed food. We also partnered with organizations like Neighbor to Neighbor, who have boxes and fill in the blank, who have food for the weekends, and making sure that that was taken care of. And then internet hotspots. That's another, you'll hear people talk around the country about just internet access in general. And that was not a new program for us during COVID. It had existed at least a year or two before that. However, what we found during COVID is a lot of families needed internet access that hadn't requested before. And we really attributed that to a couple of things, especially our high school students. They have opportunity block after school. A lot of students prefer just to get that homework done while you're at school on the school internet, and then you're going off to your athletics or music or other things. We also had students who really accessed the libraries and areas around town like that. When all of those closed and all of those resources were gone, they realized they didn't have internet in their home. So we helped mobilize. We had about 100 families that needed help very quickly at the beginning of last March. So I think we've done a great job with that. I think when you compare private and public, they're two very different worlds. I spent almost 6 years in a top level private school in Sydney, Australia on the shore. And it was eye-opening for me when I first started there, just the difference, because I'd started my career in an urban setting, which was it was 100% free and reduced environment. So I do understand the differences. It's also very different planning for a district with almost 9,000 students versus one school of a couple hundred students. And you just have they're just very, very different. It's hard to compare them. But I think, we learn from all of our counterparts, public and private, and we all share, with one another and watch what we do. And public schools did some fantastic things last spring, and our private schools did some fantastic work last spring, and we're all continuing to learn from one another.
Can you comment a little bit more about what goes on behind the scenes with preparing your staff and dealing with the unions to make sure everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that is one of the big differences between public and private. When you're dealing with a unionized staff, they have a contract that is in writing. There are certain expectations that the district must meet. And if it's outside of their regular job duties, often that needs a different meeting. Many times you have to have memorandums of understanding that are drawn up basically as almost legal documents to be able to change the role of what the expectation is. And there was a lot of discussion about that last spring, because as you can imagine, in public school, we've spent decades telling teachers, no, you're not supposed to be talking to kids when they're sitting in their bedroom on the computer. Teachers would get fired for that type of behavior. Now, all of a sudden in 2 days in March, it was okay to do that. And that's a really challenging thing. And it was challenging for staff for them to get to the comfort level, that I'm just not really comfortable with this style of teaching, because we'd never had to do it. It was brand new. And I commend our staff for learning and growing. And we're starting out this year. We know we're going to be live teaching, but it took a lot of growth.
Terrific. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Brian?
Sure. Dr. Jones, servicing the needs of special education students has been a contentious issue during the last several years. Given the multiple forum meetings held with special education parents and educators, do you see any change in satisfaction in the short term or in practices in the longer term?
It's always a goal to work well with our parent community, not just special education community, any parent community. We don't want dissatisfaction. And I will say, I think the way we ran our summer program, I'm very proud about that, because we had a lot of our special education families who said they really wanted their related services to be in person. So we opened up a school. We were under very stringent requirements. We were one of the very few districts that actually did that this summer and held face-to-face speech sessions, trying to listen to our parents and be responsive. And we have talked, we will actually have a town hall on Wednesday night where we will talk about special education. So if anyone's listening and they want to hear more, that whole segment is on special education. But we have been working also to make sure that families who have children with significant needs, if they are in the high school, for instance, we will be working with those families. So if they need to access more than just Monday, Tuesday, in order to get the appropriate services, they may be on site also Thursday, Friday. So we're doing everything we can and working with our families to provide the best, whether they are on site, whether it's hybrid or full remote.
Okay. And do you see any change longer term?
Well, we are actually going into a special education study in the fall, and that's something that the BET actually did put in the budget to assist us with that. We've put out the RFP. We have the consultants that have responded. We hope that work starts soon, and I think that will inform some of our change, having an external source come in and really look at us and tell us, here's what you're doing really, really well, and here's where you can improve. So I absolutely expect us to continue to grow in how we offer services and continuing to listen to our families.
Okay. Anne-Marie?
Dr. Jones, we recognize that the Greenwich Public Schools have done a tremendous amount of work preparing for a safe school opening in September. Despite all of our best efforts, however, there may be an outbreak within the school community, as we have recently seen in some of the college communities. Could you talk about how the system will respond to a detection of COVID?
You know, we're fortunate in Greenwich in that we have nurses who help us at every school level. We have our head of nursing, Mary Keller, who also works for the director of the Greenwich Department of Health. If we have an outbreak, or if we have just a student who goes home maybe with symptoms, they actually go in, they look at what sort of contact, if a student, for instance, had a family member that tested positive, where did that happen? They do the contact tracing, and that's all done by our Greenwich Department of Health, and they feel like they are well equipped to be able to handle that. Obviously, the biggest challenge you have is if somebody won't tell you where they were, or and there's nothing we can really do about that piece. But generally, people are fairly cooperative because they care about other people's health and safety. So we feel like we're in a good spot because we trust our Greenwich Department of Health. They do excellent work.
Can you describe, for those who might be new to the concept of cohorts, how a partial shutdown by cohort would work? Mm-hmm. And then also on a bigger level, is there the possibility of a district-wide shutdown, and what would that look like?
So a cohort is just a group of children that travel together, and you try to minimize the adults that are coming into that group, other students that would come into that group. So the cohort, for instance, has lunch together. If you're in elementary, going to recess together. If they're in middle school, they're having the same set group of teachers for that cohort of students. And those cohorts, when they travel together, as they move from group to group or class to class, if there was a case, for instance, with the cohort, then that could actually shut the whole cohort down. So in elementary, that could be a group of 25 or 50 students that have lunch together. They were out on the playground together. A student tested positive. It is highly likely both of those classes or that cohort would actually go home and quarantine for the full 14 days. But if those students haven't necessarily had a lot of contact or movement around the building with other grade levels or a different cohort, then the head of nursing and working with the Department of Health may not send the whole building home or another grade level home. And it is complex because we could have a student who rides the bus and is on the bus with, even though there's social distancing and mask, on the bus with some children from other classrooms, which could in fact send those other classrooms home to quarantine if it was a positive case with a student.
And what about a district-wide shutdown? Is that under consideration, and how would you manage? What would be the trigger for that?
Well, right now there's actually a chart that has been put out by the state Connecticut Department of Health, and it has 3 levels. It's the low, moderate, and high, and it's based on how many cases are emerging in Greenwich over a 7-day rolling period. And they look at that data. Greenwich sends our data to the state every week. And so we're watching that. If there is a spike where it starts getting up to 25 or greater, that signals to us that we should be looking at full remote. And that was developed at Harvard. It's something that they've adopted at the state level to help us at the school level determine when we should close. And most of the time that works. When we closed last March, we had to watch because of where we are. We were watching New York as well as watching Connecticut because COVID was really coming kind of up 95. So we ended up closing based on more what was happening in New York, right next door, than what was happening in, north of us in Connecticut.
So
and we did a full remote. It's, we're ready to do that. Teachers go home. It might take a 24-hour period, and that's because one of the things we couldn't do last year with an emergency shutdown is when they completely shut our buildings down, teachers couldn't be in the building. We had to get everybody out. So they realized there was a lot of equipment they wish they had at home trying to teach from, your house. So we would make sure we had that at least day for them to gather their laptop, all those materials that they want to have to be able to teach with, and then we would be ready to go. It would not be a real challenge for us, I believe, this time to get started right away.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Brian?
Dr. Jones, the concern to all of us citizens, not just the parents, has been traffic around our schools, and with the expectation that more parents will be driving their children to school. What can you say about the steps that have been taken to ensure safety, alleviate congestion? Talk about, are we going to vary pickup and drop off times, anything that along those lines?
So we have worked with our principals, obviously the Greenwich Police Department. We are using doors perhaps that weren't used in the past, multiple drop-off points and pickup points, working with the police and how the traffic pattern goes around the school, especially a school like Greenwich High School, where cars are going to drop off, what's the best way to do that. We're expecting an increase in car traffic, and that's because we're asking families who do not need the buses for essential transportation to please drive your children, because if we can't social distance on the buses, then it makes it that much more challenging to keep our doors open, once we are in our face-to-face schools. So we do expect an increase in car traffic, and I'm not going to say that it's going to be easy, because it's not easy in a great year. So with more cars driving, the drive pathway are what they are. We are staggering, for instance, at the high school, they have a longer time for students to actually get to school and get to class, to have a slower opening in that first block, and that is so that they could be staggered. So we're working with the police department on that and to do the very best of our ability. And I'm sure in that first week or so, you'll see an increased presence to make sure that the traffic is being managed well. And we always partner with our police to help us do that. But it's going to be a challenge. I can't say that the traffic in Greenwich is going to be easy in September.
Okay. There will be social distancing. There'll be masks required on the buses. And I guess the question would be, how do we enforce that? A related question, which just popped up here, is if a student on a bus tests positive, will that mean every cohort that any student on that bus participates in have to be quarantined, or is there a different dynamic for bus exposure?
So the way that actually would work is that, first of all, it always goes back to the health professionals. So I just want to be really clear about that. The school superintendent doesn't get to make those decisions, thank goodness. So if the student was the last stop on the bus and the bus arrived and it only took 5 minutes, then the level of contact is minimized, because students get on the back of the bus first and they load the bus forward. So that student would have been in the front seat, only on the bus for 5 to 7 minutes. That's where the health department would go back and look at that contact tracing. If the student was the first student on the bus and they're at the very back and they've been on the bus for a 25-minute ride, because they say that a critical window is at 15 minutes of exposure, it is highly likely that the health department, and I can't speak for them, but highly likely because of the length and duration, the students who are on that bus would be quarantined for the 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you. Anne-Marie, back to you.
Dr. Jones, turning to financial matters, what would you estimate to be the impact of COVID on the school budget? In particular, what additional costs have you incurred or do you anticipate?
The cost, I think, for every school district it's going to be large, and we are making a commitment that on our monthly business meeting, we actually have a COVID financial update. And I can just say, just in PPE equipment alone, we've probably spent around, I think, $765,000 just on PPE equipment. And the challenge is we are Greenwich, and we have a lot of dollars that go to the state, but when it comes to school funding, not much comes back. So we have $850,000 in CARES money, but almost $250,000 of that goes to the private schools. So we only have $600,000 of that funding. I was on another call today, and while they are issuing several $1 million across Connecticut, the communities that will actually get that money are the communities who have a student population for free and reduced demographic of 40% of their students or more. And because we fall below that, we're not going to qualify probably for that additional funding. There is funding from FEMA, but some of the districts are finding that also the FEMA funding is cutting out districts that don't fall in that category. So it could definitely be several $1 million. And that's something that as we go through the year, we will know what the impact is a little more, because trying to keep our buildings open will cost more. If, for instance, we have a flu season and we can't really tell the difference between flu and COVID, and we go remote for a month or 2 months or 3 months, whatever that is, then your costs look very different than they do in September. So we are going to have to get through the year to really see where we are. I will say we have a better understanding of where cost savings will come from, where the expenses are from living through last spring.
For sure. You've been at other districts, and can you talk a little bit about where Greenwich is relative to some of the other districts, particularly in Connecticut, in terms of deferred maintenance and new projects and things like that?
That's a challenging question. Every district is different. I mean, it really is. We have some buildings which New Lebanon, Glenville. Glenville's relatively new. Then we have some buildings such as JC and Old Greenwich, which are both JC's just finishing feasibility, OG's just starting, that don't have elevators in them. They are older buildings that desperately need that renovation. And it just depends on what part of the country you're in, and how those dollars are spent. But we do have old facilities that do need a lot of maintenance across the district.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
You're welcome.
Brian?
Sticking with the financial questions, Dr. Jones, many have said that the town budget process is all-consuming for our superintendent. And she chuckles. They say that too much time is spent defending budgetary requests while issues regarding ongoing district management, particularly the focus on academic achievement, are neglected. Do you agree with this? And what should Greenwich, or what could Greenwich do differently?
I think the budget process, it is a challenge because of the size of our RTM. It's a lot of subcommittees, it's a lot of meetings. That's really where I think it gets a little bit more challenging. When I think about what you could do, I did spend 3 years in Fairfield, and while their RTM is much smaller, the last year or so that I was there, they really made a commitment from the RTM that they were going to watch all of the meetings that would be the equivalent of our BET and our school board meetings. So they watched the superintendent's presentation of the budget. They watched all of the questions and answers, because the BET is pretty thorough in how they question before we ever get to the RTM. So by the time we got to the RTM, it was pretty limited questions, because you've had months of questioning and so much information out there. And I think that really could be something we could consider that would make the process run a little bit smoother, because there's a small team at central office that go to all of those meetings. And we certainly don't mind going to them in the sense that the public needs the information. But I think it's getting more, coordination, that instead of doing the same meeting 5, 6, 7 times, have one really big meeting and let's just, if it takes 4 hours, let's answer all the questions. So I think that could help. I also think though too, you know, from the budget process, it is important. It's probably one of the most important functions that we do. Everybody in the community cares about it. They want to know how dollars are spent, and they should be asking hard questions. So I think from a school superintendent standpoint, I expect it to be difficult, as in answering hard questions, and that's the way it should be.
Thank you. Anne Marie?
Dr. Jones, as you know, Greenwich and other communities have faced an ongoing problem of a revolving door in the superintendent's office. Can you talk a little bit about what causes that problem here and what we might be able to do differently as a community?
You know, that's a really good question. And for me anyway, you know, I'm thrilled to be coming back for my second year. My door's right there. I didn't walk out. And I've enjoyed it. I mean, I've really enjoyed the work. And I think, you know, part of it is just perhaps, I look at, for instance, Jill Gilday, it had to do with her husband's position. So you have that piece where it really was beyond her control. But you also in Greenwich have, tend to do interims for a full year. That's a little bit unusual. And I think it makes it even feel like there's more of a turnover when you do an interim for a year. Most districts will do an interim for only that portion of the year. They get their superintendent hired, and then they have them start in the middle of the year. So by the time you get to the end of the school year, people forget they weren't even there all year. So I think that's also part of it when you look back over time. But and it's challenging. This region in general, and I came from Virginia before here. When you're on the East Coast and the way that the budgets work, the intensity of the budget is very, very different from a political standpoint. And so, you know, perhaps there has been some of that in the past as well. If you hired somebody who hadn't been an actual school superintendent, Greenwich would be an intense environment, again, with the largest RTM, you know, in the country. You know, you have really sharp people here that know what they're doing on all of these elected bodies, and they expect you to be able to answer the questions. So it can be an intense environment in this region. And especially, again, I've been on the West Coast, I've been in Oklahoma, I was there for 13, 14 years. And, you know, the budget there, you do it in the summer, you get your dollars from the state, you set the budget, you don't go before anybody's, any elected officials. So it just depends where people come from. So I think it's a variety of things.
And do you feel like in terms of Greenwich, is there anything in specific when you look back over the last year that could shift in how the community engages with you and you with the community?
You know, I have felt extremely supported, you know, in Greenwich, and we have strong PTA. I look at this, you know, League of Women Voters. My days are running together, but yesterday, the day before, I was doing one of these with the YWCA. I find that Greenwich is very supportive. The nonprofits circle around our schools, and we really all work together. So, you know, I feel like we are one of the best school districts in the country, and there's a reason for that. And it's the human resources that people that live here, and also our staff that choose to work here.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Brian?
Sure. Dr. Jones, do you see anything beneficial to the education world coming out of our experience during this pandemic? And what do you think might change permanently going forward?
Actually, I think there's a silver lining, you know, in everything if you look hard enough. And, you know, just the technology integration and pushing towards 21st century. We have all types of platforms that we've never utilized before that can help us operate more efficiently. I think this is a prime example being on Zoom. We're a large district, you know, we have 11 elementary principals. Do they really need to all drive across town, be out of their buildings for driving, be in a 2-hour meeting so they can meet together and then drive back? Or could some of those be virtual and be much more efficient and they don't have to leave their buildings? I think there are a multitude of aspects with that. And, you know, there's, again, I think it's also just really understanding the support and the collaboration and how we can be better at supporting families, because we've really seen an aspect of struggle for some of our families where They were losing jobs. How can we be more mindful of, for instance, food insecurity? Because it wasn't just during COVID. There are families that have struggled, and maybe as a district, I think we're going to be more in tune to all of that going forward. And just academic excellence in general. Can we deliver, a high quality, education that utilizes technology in a really thoughtful and meaningful way? To be very balanced, and especially when we get back to normal. We've always said that's what we want and that's what we do, but I think our skill set is going to be incredibly higher now than it was.
Follow-on question. At the BOE, BET, and RTM meetings, attendance by voters, by citizens via video conferencing has been far beyond previous in-person attendance. Do you welcome the increased scrutiny in the meetings that you're involved in, and from the parents and from taxpayers?
I do welcome it. I think that's actually a silver lining. I've never seen as many people attend our Board of Education meetings as they are virtually. Last night we did again a town hall for elementary at 5 o'clock, middle school. Then we did high school. We were on from 5 to 8, and each one of those meetings had over 200 people. And as you know, sometimes in a board meeting, you might have 10 people there, and definitely not staying till late in the night. It's different when they can be at home on their couch. They'll actually hang with us, a lot of them, till almost the end. So I think that's been phenomenal, and I hope it continues. While we can't be totally virtual, when we are in person and we're back having meetings, we need to find a highly effective way, and it may just be like this, to stream so that people can join these meetings from their home, because I don't think it's that the interest isn't there. I think people have children at home, they have, busy lives, and it's hard to go physically be present with the number of meetings and opportunities there are. So I absolutely hope this doesn't go away and that it's blended with our live meetings.
Great. Okay. So those are the questions that we had prepared, and thank you, Dr. Jones, for that. We're going to turn now to the questions that have been submitted either online prior to the meeting or during tonight's session by viewers. Anne-Marie will have the first question, and we're going to alternate back and forth. And what I'm going to suggest, Anne-Marie, is if you take a look at the questions that are coming in live, and I'm going to look over at the spreadsheet and try to get some of the questions that have come previously. Back to you.
And before we do that, Anne-Marie,
oh.
Sorry, before we do that, I just wanted to let the audience see that they can submit their questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of their screen if they're on a desktop, or towards the top of their screen if they're on a mobile device. And as we said, we'll try to get through as many as possible. Anne-Marie, back to you.
Thank you. So one of the questions that's been submitted states, the state now permits a hybrid model, and other districts are offering this model for all grades, not just high school, which is the current plan for Greenwich Public Schools. Will this option be considered in Greenwich? Why or why not? We've put ourselves in a different circumstance in K-8 than some of the other districts, and I don't think the conversation will stop. We have a board meeting on Thursday night. They listen to the community. We are one of the few districts trying to return, but there are some differences in our plan. When you also look at, for instance, K-5, we've worked really hard to get our class sizes down and to approach that from day one, so that when we are all in, we don't have, like some of the other districts, an average class size of 26. And I reached out even this last weekend to check in with some other superintendents. They could not get their classrooms to social distance beyond 1 to 2 feet. And that was concerning to them, which is understandably. We are social distancing between 3 and 6 feet. We have small class sizes. We're social distancing, we're cohorting. So we're doing some things differently. Also in K-5, even just the way that we are managing our remote is different than other districts, where some are just doing the web streaming. We have huge concerns about that for a 7-year-old. I don't even think Sesame Street can entertain children for 4 hours, 5 hours. Just watching your classroom, what's going on, it would be very difficult for a little one. And we have chosen to try to have a teacher, well, not try, have a teacher, with a class
of children that are online so that they have that interaction. We're one of the only districts that are taking that approach. I would say I've had the most questions this week probably from the middle school and definitely from Eastern because it's a larger middle school. But I think people have to keep in mind Eastern and Western are both capacity-wise within their buildings the same. It's just that Eastern was built to hold more students than Western. And at both of those buildings, the principals have worked really, really hard. Again, for social distancing, we've made sure the class sizes are running smaller. They're in those groupings of 100 with the same set of teachers. And, you know, we feel like we've put some things in place that are very successful. Also, people have to keep in mind that even in a building like Eastern, our enrollment is down naturally just about 40 students, which often happens in middle school. You have a larger 8th grade class that moves out, a little bit smaller 6th grade class comes in, but they're down naturally about 40. And then you're going to have students who opt out for remote. So even in that building, they're going to be smaller than they've been in the past. And we haven't been able to share as much of that because our opt-out form doesn't close until Wednesday night at midnight. We had closed last Friday, but we heard enough from our families that wanted us to reopen that because of the storm, and they had been dealing with power outages. So by tomorrow night, we'll have a better idea, and I'm hoping it helps people understand what our numbers look like, and our numbers are a little different. Some of the districts literally just couldn't get the spacing for their children. So that's been part of our approach. We feel like we've really prepared to try to bring K-8 back, and especially with the infection rate where it is. And again, instructionally for K-5, we think it's pretty essential that we try to not go to a hybrid because we just are not willing, and most of the other districts around us, like I say, are doing the web streaming for little ones, and we don't want to do that. We don't think it's best for children.
Thank you. Brian?
You stole one of my questions I was going to ask, but I'll ask another one here. How will middle school remote classes work? Will they be live streaming into class, or will they have remote teachers?
So it's a little bit of both when you start talking about secondary. The number one thing we have to make sure is that we have a high quality teacher who can teach the content and the subject content. If you have an algebra class, you want to make sure you have somebody who can teach algebra. So we have some teachers who, for whatever reasons, have a medical exemption where they need to teach from home. That teacher, if that's a high qualified math teacher, they may have a remote class for just that math class. For other classes, the student actually has their set schedule and they will web stream back into those classes, which are live classes, and they will be able to interact with the teacher. The teacher will have that direct lesson at the beginning. We have the webcams, we have the audio. Those are all upgrades we've made in getting prepared for September.
Okay. And a follow-on is, what will the teaching look like for elementary and middle schoolers hopefully if, and when asked to stay home in quarantine due to COVID exposure?
In elementary, if it's just one student because a sibling tested positive, it's going to be handled more like when a student is homesick. They work individually with the teacher. The teacher will work with the family to give them, work at home, just like they always would. In middle school, if it's one student, that's where it really, and in high school as well, it's where it really helps because they can still web stream back into their classes from home if they're home for the full 14 days. So it'll be much easier in secondary for them to keep up with those high content areas. And again, elementary will be like it normally is. And if it's a full class, I will say that's the other question people ask. If it's a full classroom and everybody, or a cohort, then they're all online together, just like the Wednesdays will look at the high school.
Good. Thank you. Anne-Marie?
Dr. Jones, can you talk a little bit, a couple questions have come in about masks and ranging from all the way K through 12, all the different divisions. And in particular, what does enforcement look like with masks, and how do you take into account, for instance, kids who may have sensory integration problems or issues along those lines?
So the mask is actually a legal requirement in Connecticut. So we have the duty to uphold it. We must make sure people have masks on the bus, and inside the buildings. When you talk about a compliancy issue, there are a couple of different things. First of all, if a student is just willfully, not being compliant, it's a discipline issue like it would be, for anything else, another infraction that a student would have. And the administrators are working with that student, they're working with the parents, in order to make sure that it doesn't happen again. When we look at it from a medical standpoint, the Connecticut Department of Health over the last really 2 weeks has come out much stronger and has said that if it's a medical reason that they can't wear a mask, that they are not safe to be in school, and they should choose the remote option, because mask and that social distancing are two of the key components, and especially the mask, for keeping people safe. Now, we know we're going to have some students who do have learning challenges that are causing those issues. With those families, we want to continue to work with them, try different masks, different types of masks, because I'm sure, as everybody on this call knows, one mask can just be so uncomfortable and you put on another one and it's okay. We need to really help our children, try to see if we can find what works for them. We also have shields that, we bought for children and young people. So it may be a unique shield that has their, baseball hat on the top in order to work with children to get them to wear them. So we're going to do everything possible in those situations.
Terrific, thank you. Brian?
Sure. This is a sort of a two-sided question. We talk at P-TECH about how we can support the schools, and we'd be interested in your thoughts about how we can help, from a volunteer point of view. But also, can you talk about how will schools and teachers support parents so that they can work with their students through, whether it's remote, whether it's through distance, whether it's in person or hybrid? How do we juggle both of those pieces?
I think, as school starts, one thing that we've learned is that sometimes our students aren't sometimes as stressed as much as our parents, because they want to know what the students are doing. They don't know how Google Classroom is set up. They don't understand some of the platforms, especially if you have younger children, you're trying to really watch over their shoulder and they happen to be remote, or, just in general, trying to help the students. And we need to make sure we do some more parent workshops to help parents understand the tools that their students are using. We also had a consultant who worked with us in 3 of our buildings last year on family engagement. And we learned a lot from that experience, just trying to have certain parent events. How do you reach out individually to make sure parents feel supported? How do we conference with parents? And especially when they can't be inside the building. Our back to school open house is going to be virtual, making sure we still include parents, in the aspect of school during this challenging time. But I think it's, again, partnering with families and parents. And PTA obviously is one of our biggest supporters. And, meeting regularly with PTAC really helps me hear from the families about what's working and what's not. But they do that at the building level as well. They all have very strong PTA leaders in their building who help them kind of have the pulse of the community, because sometimes something that's happening on one side of town or the other side of town or in one particular school is unique and specific to that school. And so working, again, with our families, I think in the way that we would if everything was normal, stay highly engaged, but doing some parent workshops for the tools can be very helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anne-Marie?
Dr. Jones, can you talk a little bit about what has been done in terms of infrastructure within each of the schools? So for instance, HVAC systems, water fountains, high touch areas with a mind towards prevention.
So water fountains, we wanted to turn them off, but we can't by OSHA standards, but they have signs on them. We do not want people using them. So that's something we have to really reinforce. Our paper towel holders are touchless in our restrooms now. So you can grab a paper towel, the next one pops out. We will have also that kind of grab and go tissue outside of a bathroom door, helping our students understand how can you use basically that tissue to touch the door so your hand doesn't touch if it's that type of a door. We have striping in our halls down the center so that students know which side of the hall to be walking on for social distancing, with feet that are directional, pointing them in the right direction. I'm just trying to think. We have hand sanitizer for all of our rooms. We have wipes for all of our rooms. We have clear dividers in elementary that can sit on a student's desk just to add another layer, on their desk that they can see through it. We have plexiglass around the district. We're changing out a lot of furniture. Luckily, we had some old desks still in storage because over the last 2 to 3 years, we've tried to change furniture to 21st century to collaborate for children. So we've pulled a lot of old furniture out. We're looking for storage for the new stuff. So furniture changes, it has been a huge piece. And I think I said plexi. So those are probably some of the biggest pieces.
That sounds great. Can you talk a little bit about the air quality issue, like in terms of HVAC systems and how that's going to work?
Yeah, so for air quality, every building is different. So in your newer buildings where you have the HVAC, there is a fresh air return that's part of that system. If you're in a building that has more like window units, that's where we're really working to make sure that there's some windows that can open if that's possible to do. So we've gone around the district where, for instance, one building, the windows probably haven't been opened in decades. So it's unscrewing the windows so it can now open, and then getting the company out to get a screen on the window so that it's safe to open it because it's an older building. So we're doing things like that. We had windows at our high school, again, that just when it was originally built were meant to be open. When the building was fully air conditioned, they weren't supposed to open anymore, but it's in, for instance, the corridor where we feel like having some fresh air in there because that's a passing area for students. They'll be able to open some of those windows. So we're doing things in every building, and it's unique to the building.
Terrific, thank you. Brian?
Sure. Dr. Jones, sorry about that. If students do not have a medical reason for not wearing a mask, but still refuse to wear a mask, how will that situation be dealt with?
Well, it becomes a disciplinary issue. So I'm going to say it's a secondary student where they're just being defiant. But we will not have students in Greenwich that are like this, but I'm going to answer it. That's where you go to, unfortunately, they get suspended. You go through your normal discipline process because this is the law. It's not something that Greenwich is the only community saying we need to do this. It's the law. So we have a duty to uphold it for health and safety. And that's why it exists. So we'll follow our normal process like we would for other infractions.
I know the Board of Education is working on a policy for masks. Can you talk a little bit about that and about what might be acceptable or not acceptable and what that reasoning behind that is?
I think the mask policy is going to be helpful for our community because we've looked at the model policy from the state that CABE, who's the organization for our Board of Education, actually crafted. And then our policy committee has gone through that to tweak it for Greenwich so it's unique for us, where they feel comfortable with what's in it. It does define the type of mask. For instance, gaiters will not be acceptable, and that is because they've been shown scientifically to not be safe. They do allow too many of the particles or droplets to escape. Also, a student, which again we deal with young people, they can't wear a Halloween mask from last year and say that that's their mask. So it defines things like that. And then making sure the 2-ply, 3-ply, just different type of masks that would be acceptable to help families understand that, number one, they do have a safe mask and what that standard is. So that policy will have a second read on Thursday night.
Thank you.
Well,
Anne-Marie?
Dr. Jones, a number of people have asked about how electives and specials such as art and music will be administered this year. And what are your thoughts on that, especially as it shifts from elementary to middle, and then for the high school students who would normally do orchestra or band or theater?
It looks very different to try to get our doors open in September. In elementary and middle, it's really based around general music. So the teachers actually are coming together, reworking the curriculum. But we are, again, using the guidance that we have from really across the country that blowing on instruments is a higher risk activity. So we're not doing that to start the year. The same way with things like chorus. We're not having chorus to start the year. They're having general music. Now I say they're not having it. We're looking at, we would like to, if we have the staff to do it, still be able to have some virtual where the student could still go home from school, have a mini lesson from the teacher that the student could watch, and they can still practice, upload their practice. So we still, it's not that we want to not have it, we just can't have it in person right now. And the other thing is having the space to have those sorts of courses, because you really need to, not only from the blowing aspect, having something over the horn, you would have to have either a mask off or a slit in the mask, which is really not deemed safe. Even if we had 10 to 12 feet in between, we just don't have the space. Now, we do have our orchestra, which we're able to go 12 feet at the high school, and they have smaller numbers of students, so they will be able to continue at the high school. But it's literally going to be day by day, and we're going to watch as we reopen, especially in our high school area, what we can and can't do. Our art will continue as far as elementary students all will have an art kit basically, because they can't share materials any longer. So that's being ordered, so they each have their own art kit. The same at middle school. They will have different activities that they will do that are art based, but they will have their own set of materials.
Thank you. Brian?
We have a couple of questions related to advanced learning program. I'm going to steal one of Anne-Marie's questions here. Why have teachers for the ALP program been added while teachers for our special education program have not been added?
So we have added staff, not only in the ALP program, everything from 13 custodial to ELA. The ALP program is to help the entire elementary school population. So our goal is trying to get our general education classrooms down as low as possible. So our students, in ALP, we generally had a 1.7, which is kind of a weird, you didn't have 2 full-time teachers. You had a 0.7, a part of a teacher, and then they would run to another building for a part of the day. And so now we are trying to adjust that so that when ALP students go out of the classroom, which they've always done, the model's not any different, they're just out for longer so they can have what we're calling a super block, which leaves fewer students in the general education classroom. So a teacher, again, can have those small numbers of 12, 13 students that are there to really have great intensive instruction for children. It benefits everybody. And that is part of the model. And the same with our students that go to special ed services, or if it's a student who has a teacher that's pushing in for special education services, there's a big difference in having 13 children in the class than having 17. So it's a model that benefits everybody.
Okay. And a follow-up to that, also ALP related, before the end of the year, the ALP placement process was not completed. Can you talk a little bit about what is going to happen between now and the start of school, or will that go through and impact the startup?
So they are working on that right now. It will be rolling, as the year starts. Some of the students had completed testing, but then when the buildings were shut down, all of that was stuck in the building, so they couldn't go back in and get it. Some of the students, completed one piece, but not the other. And there are about 800 students right now that they're working through from when we closed in March. So the timeline is between now and when school starts, they're working as feverishly as they can to determine which students are eligible, which students need more testing, and that will be ongoing once school starts to get caught up.
Okay. Anne-Marie, hopefully I didn't steal any of your questions.
There's lots to turn to, don't worry about it.
Okay.
For Dr. Jones, can you talk a little bit about what's being done to protect the teachers? Because as we all know, particularly for a teacher who's symptomatic, not only can they not teach in the classroom, but they can't teach from home virtually either if they're sick. What is the plan you guys have for that? And in particular, do you have substitute teachers lined up ready to step in?
So first of all, to answer what we're doing for teachers. So we do have, the mask, we have the PPE equipment for teachers. If they want a shield, most people that try them don't like them because they also have to wear a mask with them. We've also set aside the front of the room. It's what we call the safe zone. So they know that they've got a good distance away from where that first student would sit. If a teacher gets sick, it's really not unlike any other year. On a good year, we struggle with substitutes, and we are trying to make sure substitutes aren't across the district. There are subs assigned to particular buildings so that, again, they're not going from building to building to building. And could we have a sub shortage this year? Absolutely, we could. I think everybody in the region would say that. And if that happens and it's in the middle of flu season, it could push us to full remote. If a teacher is too ill to teach their class, we are definitely looking for a sub. If we don't have a sub, it's either teaming them up with another teacher, and that's going to be part of the problem solving of something we haven't lived through before. And if you don't have teachers, you don't have teachers. And so from the substitute perspective, but we are trying to recruit right now as much as we can.
Thank you. Brian?
There's quite a few questions, and I know some of this probably cannot be answered, but any generalizations that you can draw or data you can provide on the number of teachers that have asked to be remote versus in person, the number of students that have been asked to be remote versus in person, any background, or any enrollment figures that you can point to. I know it's a moving target.
Yeah. If anybody that wants that information, they can either watch Thursday night or follow up after Thursday night. Our opt-outs close tomorrow at midnight. And just to give you an example, over the weekend, when we opened it back up, at least in my mind, I was thinking, okay, this is being opened up for the parents that are thinking, okay, I really want to go full remote now. And my power was out. I didn't have time to think about it. But it was actually the opposite. We had 50 families that said, oh, we don't want to be remote anymore. We really want to be face-to-face. So we don't really know until we close tomorrow night. As far as our staffing, there are two elements to staffing. One is the staffing who are having their meetings with HR about whether or not they need accommodations in the classroom, and maybe that's a shield that they're asking for or something of that nature, an N95 mask. Or is it a teacher who has a situation where they're asking to be a remote teacher based off of a medical history? They have to bring their doctor's note and have all that information filled out when they meet with HR. So we're working through all of those issues right now. Then there's also a third group, and those are teachers that said, if you need a remote teacher, I would be happy to teach remote. And those staffing issues are still literally being worked through today. Okay. So by Thursday night, we'll be in a better place when we know what the opt-outs are.
So stay tuned, everyone.
Yeah.
A follow-on question that in regard to remote learners, for the middle school and the high school, they do orientation sessions. How will the remote learner students be included in the orientations?
So for orientation for freshmen, I think that's what they're talking about.
For freshmen and sixth graders, I believe also has.
Right. Mr. Mayo was actually addressing that last night. I think the intent is to make sure that they have that opportunity to also meet the teacher. But it's during the orientation, if they're not comfortable coming to school, it is tougher to have the same orientation experience if you're not comfortable coming to school and stepping foot in the high school. So they were meeting on that. I know is how Mr. Mayo answered that. They haven't resolved yet what that's going to look like. And I think once they know, again, how many freshmen are we talking about? Are we talking about 100 freshmen, or are we talking about 20? So that's going to be helpful for them too, just the sheer numbers of how many students you would need to socially distance. Where's the space? How do you house that? How do you walk around the building? So once they have those answers this week, I think it's going to help them with some of those orientation questions.
Okay, great. Anne-Marie?
So Dr. Jones, the August SAT was recently canceled. And I'm curious if you could provide some context and background to families on the decision-making process that goes on behind that, and how that plays out moving into the fall for not only school day test options, but also Saturday test options that are hosted at Greenwich High School.
So the date you're referencing that we just canceled on Monday, that was a hosting site for SAT, not just at Greenwich High School. But usually on those days, we would see a high percentage of our students. So we have felt in the past it was very beneficial to host that. So what happened with this one, we had about 433 students who registered. And of those 433, only 80 were Greenwich High School. And so the concern was we need to reach out, number one, let's get direction from the Department of Health on, is this a health and safety risk? Because not only did it have a lot of students that were not our students or from this region, they were coming from all over the tri-state area. And we actually went through and sorted and looked at it. It was 90 different high schools. It was a very unusual demographic. And with all of the social gathering and the information that we hear about what we should and shouldn't be doing, we reached out to the Department of Health. And basically they said, you really shouldn't host it unless you could do it outside, which of course you can't take an SAT outside on the football field in the sun for hours. And because we also have to pay for the disinfecting, everything that comes along with that. And then the other suggestion was, well, you would have to take that group and spread them over all 15 of your buildings, which logistically, again, we have buildings we're preparing to get opened. We don't have the furniture. We've placed all the furniture, you know, to be socially distanced. You'd have to go in and start tearing everything apart. So logistically, we couldn't do it based on the health guidance of what we would have to do to make it work. And we didn't want to cancel it, but that's why. The September date is actually for our high school. We host it for this Connecticut school day. So there will not be an issue with that September date. That is a Greenwich High School date.
And what about future Saturdays that you guys are also hosting for the general public? How will you you'll make those decisions as you move along?
You do make them as you move along. And ultimately, again, we reach out to the Department of Health. This was a really unusual, it was just a really unusual demographic of students who signed up, of what we don't normally see of that magnitude. So, you know, we'll have to make those decisions. But I think, you know, to keep in mind for families that are really worried about it, this is happening not just here, it is all in this region. And the colleges will, I truly believe the colleges will be adapting to this again, because they know it's going to be hard to have these testing dates. And Connecticut is one of the more fortunate states because we do have the SAT school day. A lot of states do not. So, you know, Connecticut's very fortunate with that.
True. Brian?
Sure. There was a lot of controversy earlier in the summer over the cuts to the budget, and then extra money was found. Can you talk a little bit about what happened and what are we putting in place to prevent that from going forward?
Yeah, it wasn't that extra money was found. COVID is very, very complex. And when you're going through the process, for instance, how many subs we used during the year, one of the big issues was our bus contract. And until we settled our bus contract, you know, the amount of money that contract was going to cost us, generally, if our buses don't run at all, we wouldn't be paying for the buses. That's the way the contract is written. But through the governor's executive order, we had to go in and negotiate. So that made a huge difference to us at the end of the year in covering, and I'm just going to use one area, like our special education outplacement expense that was in the hole. The bus contract, once that was settled, and we got one of the best settlements in the state. And I credit Sean, our financial whiz, for making that happen. And it made a big difference to our finances. Then as you get to the end of the year and you start the closeout, you start closing every single account, and we have thousands. And there were buildings who had encumbered, for instance, I'm just going to say cases of paper. Well, then we went full remote. And although the whole purchase order was placed, it was encumbered. It didn't actually get spent because we didn't ever return. So by the time that added up, that is really how that happened. The way we would approach it this next year, again, this was a learning curve because we haven't lived through COVID before. We would make sure all of those accounts, we would start closing them out probably a month earlier than we did, just if we had been in school and then all of a sudden we're faced with this COVID, because the expenses all shift. And we didn't know, for instance, how much electricity we were going to save without having the buildings open. There were a lot of things like that we learned that I think we would be better this year, knowing how COVID is going to impact our building. And one of the questions I get is, when are we going to ask for an interim to help us with the expenses? That's one reason that won't happen really early, most likely in the year. It could be a little bit later on because we need to know more about where we are with COVID. Are we managing to keep our doors open, which is going to cost more? or are we managed, or have we been pushed to full remote for a variety of reasons, which you'll find some cost savings if that happens. So it'll be probably, before we truly know what this is cost for this year, it will be the spring.
Thank you. Back to you, Anne Marie, for the close, I believe.
So I'm going to say thank you very much to Dr. Jones, and I'm going to hand this off to Aya for some closing remarks.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne Marie. I wanted to thank everybody for attending and go through a couple of slides just to give you some additional information. As we said, and as you heard, there is an additional Board of Education special meeting Thursday at 6 p.m. This Thursday at 6 p.m. You can see it on the screen here. Don't worry, you don't have to scribe this down. We will share this with you by sending it out to you tomorrow morning. And it will also be available on the various websites, the League's website, LWVG.org, as well as the BOE websites and school websites. Additionally, if you are interested in seeing the answers to many questions that have been asked over the last couple of months regarding back to school protocols because of COVID, you can navigate to greenwichschools.org, district information, school planning team, it's a mouthful, so please bear with me, and resources, district reopening documents, frequently asked questions, and you select the document that is named frequently asked questions submitted to Community Town Hall, July 30th. As I said, it was a mouthful, but if you need to see some more answers, that is a very good resource. So again, we will share all of this with you tomorrow through an email, and you can access it on our websites. And just before we log out and sign off, thank you again for attending. If you liked what you saw today, and if you'd like to learn more about civics and engaging in local government and information about anything to do with elections, please visit our website, lwvg.org. We will be launching a new website in another day or two, so stay tuned for that. You'll see a lot more, and you'll be able to find things a lot more easily, and hopefully you'll be able to access a lot of resources, events, and RSVP for them online. We have our annual meeting and fireside chat with Annie Lamont coming up on September 16th. October's also busy. We have 100 Years of Women's Voting, a panel discussion jointly sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Greenwich, the Greenwich Library, WNYC, and it's going to be an excellent Zoom Q&A session. So please sign up for that as well. And the October debates are coming up. We have the Congressional District 4, the State Senate Districts 149, 150, and 151. We'll let you know when they are happening, but it will be in October, so stay tuned for that. And of course, don't forget to vote on November 3rd. It's very important that we all get out and vote. So your polling locations, if you don't know where they are, you will be able to find them on the League of Women Voters Greenwich website. We will share the information with you through various emails and on our social media platforms, being Facebook and Instagram. And last but definitely not least, if you have already participated in one of our Harvard Case Method civics projects, you know how fantastic they are. We're excited that there's another one coming up in November. November 10th is the date. If you want to see more information on that, again, please visit our website for those details, and we will share those with you as well. That is an oversubscribed event, so if you are lucky enough to be able to get in, you need to sign up very soon. So anything else that we have going on, we will share with you as they come up, but please do join us for these events in September, October, November. And thank you for participating. Thank you, Dr. Jones. It was a pleasure having you as our guest speaker. Thank you to our moderators, Anne Marie Hesser and Brian Pablunas. And thank you to PTAC for co-sponsoring this. Good night, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.